The federal government has defended the assistance it has provided to Julian Assange. The WikiLeaks founder is yet to comment publicly after losing his Supreme Court appeal against extradition to Sweden. Supporters of Mr Assange claim the US will seek to extradite him on espionage charges once he's on Swedish soil. Both the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister insist the government's response to the Assange case has been appropriate.
I'm proud to report that in accord with Australian practice, Mr Assange has received as much consular support as we can give to people from the Australian High Commission present during his most recent trial, interaction with his lawyers, a sharing of information, indeed information in the last 2 days on the implications of the court decision that's now been handed down.
If at any stage in the future Mr Assange faces legal proceedings from the United States, we would, for Mr Assange, as we would for any other Australian citizen, seek assurances from the United States in relation to due process. The Australian government cannot interfere in the judicial processes of other countries, but of course we will continue to closely monitor proceedings against Mr Assange and continue to provide full consular assistance to him.
The US Ambassador to Australia, Jeffrey Bleish, has denied suggestions that an arrest warrant has already been issued.
It's a secret warrant, period. They don't exist. And again, that's just another invention.
And an Australian legal expert says it's extremely unlikely that the Swedes would agree to the extradition in any case.
They are bound not to under the European Extradition Convention unless the British government consents. So it comes down to whether the British government would consent. And I think that the case has attracted so much publicity, so much public concern has been raised, and also the very basis of the act in question has been called for a re-examination in Britain. I don't see the British government doing that.
But former CIA officer Ray McGovern, who's a supporter of WikiLeaks, says there is evidence that the Americans would like to try Julian Assange. I spoke to him a short time ago. Ray McGovern, thanks very much for talking to us.
You're most welcome.
Australia's Foreign Minister has said nothing the US has said points to a planned indictment of Julian Assange. Does that mean the US has no plans to extradite Julian Assange?
No, it means your foreign minister is being very disingenuous. We know from fairly good sources that there is already a sealed secret indictment against Assange, and that if he comes here, or even if he goes to Sweden, he's what we call in these states a dead duck.
OK, let's go back to that sealed secret indictment. That source is from an email that WikiLeaks accessed from Stratfor, and it was sent from Fred Burton, who's the Vice President of Stratfor. He said, "We, meaning the US government, have a sealed indictment on Assange. Please protect." Would Fred Burton know?
Yes, he would. Stratfor is laced through with alumni from the FBI, the CIA, and other security services. They're very well plugged in. He wouldn't be saying this that definitively if he were not sure that it's the case. It doesn't surprise me at all. There is all kinds of circumstantial evidence lying around and about that the grand jury has been impaneled and that it has returned an indictment.
You said earlier that you think if Julian Assange is extradited to the US, he'll be a dead duck. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean he'll spend the rest of his life in prison, as will almost certainly Bradley Manning. You see, we used to have judicial procedures for such things in this country, but as recently as Tuesday, the New York Times ran a major article talking about the president's felt power to have kill lists, to have lists of people who are said to be al-Qaeda sympathizers or operatives, and without any judicial process, he feels it's possible to zap them and deliver them just punishment, in so many words. Now, I'm not saying that Julian Assange will be zapped by a predator drone while he's in Stockholm, but it's almost as bad. He will be brought to the United States. The United States has been very fierce about proceeding against what they call leakers, because there's lots to hide. And ironically, the WikiLeaks documents themselves show, number one, that Sweden is hardly a neutral country anymore, and number two, that even Australia is susceptible to severe U.S. pressure to put the put an end to Assange's activities, let's put it that way.
How can you say with any authority that Julian Assange, if he was extradited to the US, would end up spending life in prison? I mean, there are defences within the US Constitution of freedom of speech. If Julian Assange is a publisher and a journalist, surely he has protection under the US Constitution.
Well, that's the way it used to be. I'm very, very sorry to say that respect for the Constitution has gone out the window. The most recent example, which I just cited, is the president's assertion of the right to kill people on a kill list without judicial process, without charge, without trial, without anything else. And he's been doing it, and they're bragging about it.
Why are you a supporter of Julian Assange? You're a former CIA officer. Most CIA officers believe state secrets should remain state secrets.
Well, there is an ethical dialogue, a gradation of values. There is the piece of paper, the secrecy promise that we all make to keep confidential information secret. That is based on the fact that it would endanger national security if it were released. Now, I made that promise, but when Bradley Manning looked at his promise and saw that if he released the video of that terrible attack, the collateral murder video, if he released these documents, then he might be able to expose what's really going on in the world, what's really going on in these wars, and that is what ethicists call a supervening value. Stop a war, stop more killing, that certainly supervenes the promise that one has made to protect classified information, all the more so since the protection of this information has nothing to do with national security, has to do with covering up war crimes.
Ray McGovern, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for talking to us.
You're most welcome.
Ray McGovern, former CIA agent, speaking there via Skype. Lizzie O'Shea, you're a supporter of WikiLeaks. You've spoken at rallies in favour of Julian Assange. What do you make of the US ambassador's comments today? He said last night, he said in response to Julian Assange's extradition that it's not something the US cares about. Isn't that a clear message that the US doesn't want to extradite him?
He's saying what I expected he would say. I don't think they are concerned with the Swedish proceedings. They wouldn't have tried to extradite him from the UK because, in the current situation, because they would have had to wait in line behind Sweden. So clearly the Swedish proceedings need to resolve before they make their move, and they're very happy, I think, for Assange to sit in prison and wait while they can compile evidence against him and prepare to ultimately charge him. I think he's got every reason to be extremely concerned about the steps the US is taking about a possible extradition back there. It's clear that the US treats prisoners and who it perceives to be its enemies in very serious fashion, in ways that are very confronting for people who support human rights. So I think he's got every right to be concerned, and I'm not surprised by those comments, but I don't think they reflect what's actually going on in relation to Assange in the US.
But Jeffrey Bleisch also said, frankly, if he's in Sweden, then there is a less robust extradition relationship than there is between the US and the UK.
Well, that's not right. There are temporary surrender provisions which can permit Sweden to temporarily surrender Assange to the US. This is an extremely complex legal situation which involves a variety of jurisdictions, as you say. So I don't think that is of particular significance. In my view, if the US wants to extradite Assange, they'll find a way and they'll do their best to charge him. And I think where he actually is at the time is just something that might get in the way, but won't be a significant obstacle for their end game.
Annabel, the government's been criticised for not doing more for Julian Assange. Is that a fair criticism?
Well, I don't know the exact details of exactly what consular assistance they've successfully supplied to Assange in the UK. I mean, consulates can offer assistance and they tend to be taken up as much as the recipient wants or needs them to be taken up. Obviously, Mr Assange hasn't been short of legal advice, for one thing, and our, acting consular official, Jeffrey Robertson's been very helpful on that front. But look, I think that the worst consular disservice that the government has done for Mr Assange is to kind of declare him guilty pretty early in the proceedings, courtesy of the Prime Minister herself. Now that's not really an allegation she's repeated since, but it was a bit of a clanger, I think, to part with at the very beginning of the proceedings.
Richard?
There wasn't a lot of wiggle room that she left herself to get out of it either when she said it. Listen, I think Jeffrey Robertson made a number of the points very clearly last night on the ABC, and he certainly hasn't had a problem with the process that's been going on at the moment, so I don't know that there's much validity in the charges that, Australia's not done what it should have done. I am concerned, though, with Bob Carr's words in that interview. He might have chosen them a bit more carefully when he said that he was sharing or his consular officials were sharing information with Julian Assange's lawyers. I would have thought there'd be alarm bells going off in Washington at that kind of statement.
OK, Lizzie, you've written about this issue of European arrest warrants previously. Why are they controversial to human rights lawyers?
Well, Jeffrey Robertson described them as draconian, and I think that's a fair description. And Assange isn't the normal character you'd expect to be in this situation, and his profile has highlighted some of the very significant problems with the European arrest warrant or EAW system. It's a multilateral treaty, so it's designed to dispense with certain safeguards in favour of creating a frontier-free society in Europe. The problem with that is you're dealing with a whole lot of legal systems that are quite different. The Australian legal system is very much more similar to the British legal system than it is to France, for example. So it creates all sorts of problems. A really good example is Poland. Poland has a requirement legally that it pursue prosecutions for crimes or alleged crimes, and that means ultimately issuing a European arrest warrant if somebody has left the jurisdiction. So in 2009 they issued close to 5,000 European arrest warrants, and that's compared to the UK, who issued 220. Now that's hardly efficient, but it's clearly a problem that wasn't really foreseen at the time that the system was set up. It's a rush job that was done in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and was pushed through Parliament in the UK, I think, with not enough scrutiny. And you saw that in the judgments in the Assange case. There's a whole range of other problems, but fundamentally it's a lacklustre system with some very serious shortcomings.
The federal government has defended the assistance it has provided to Julian Assange. The WikiLeaks founder is yet to comment publicly after losing his Supreme Court appeal against extradition to Sweden. Supporters of Mr Assange claim the US will seek to extradite him on espionage charges once he's on Swedish soil. Both the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister insist the government's response to the Assange case has been appropriate.
I'm proud to report that in accord with Australian practice, Mr Assange...
And I think that the case has attracted so much publicity, so much public concern has been raised, and also the very basis of the act in question has been called for a re-examination in Britain. I don't see the British government doing that.
But former CIA officer Ray McGovern, who's a supporter of WikiLeaks, says there is evidence that the Americans would like...
The United States, we would, for Mr Assange, as we would for any other Australian citizen, seek assurances from the United States in relation to due process. The Australian government cannot interfere in the judicial processes of other countries, but of course we will continue to closely monitor proceedings against Mr Assange and continue to provide full consular assistance to him.
The US Ambassador to Australia, Jeffrey Bleish, has denied suggestions that an arrest warrant has already been issued.
It's a secret warrant, period. They don't exist. And again, that's just another invention.
And an Australian legal expert says it's extremely unlikely that the Swedes would agree to the extradition in any case.
They are bound not to under the European Extradition Convention unless the British government consents. So it comes down to whether the British government would consent.
The judge has received as much consular support as we can give to people from the Australian High Commission present during his most recent trial, interaction with his lawyers, a sharing of information, indeed information in the last 2 days on the implications of the court decision that's now been handed down.
If at any stage in the future Mr Assange faces legal proceedings from